Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on the Reformation and Counter Reformation. Now, I know you're watching this probably because we have to do our recitations, and I just want to assure you that the lecture is a lot shorter than what we had for the Renaissance. And the reason for that is we only really have one session for this. So if there are things I'm not really able to tackle, that's because we've run out of time. Really sorry about that. So, anyway, this lecture is the third in our series on Module 3, or Early Modern Historical Origins of Europe. Okay, so uh, basically, we're just continuing the questions now. What are the key transformations in this era? Ano ba yung ambag ng Reformation sa konsepto natin ng Europe? Okay, so for this lecture, there are four focal points that I want to look at. Beginnings in Germany, the spread of Protestantism, Catholic Reformation, and religious wars. So, firstly, uh, why do we need to study the Reformation exactly? Mm, I think we're gonna start with some thoughts from the present day, and like this is just me, right? I think as Filipinos who are majority still Christian or Catholic, and of course the third largest group is Islamic, diba? But that's a different kind of set of contexts. But for those who identify as Christian and Catholic, there is a very deep, centuries long divide that is theological in nature na hindi natin na-realize it's the Reformation that splits people. And that split often can impact the way individuals will decide on their religious life, on their life partners, or even how to raise their children, right? And of course, Reformation era Christianity has evolved a lot um, in comparison with where we are today. Pero the root of that difference of Catholics versus Christians and all of the branches of Christians, it's a European phenomenon, right? So if we want to really understand where this comes from, why it happened to begin with, and whether it might still be relevant in present day life, I think it's necessary to return to its roots and just kind of gain context for where everyone is coming from exactly. Yeah, there's a lot more I wish I could say about that, but this isn't a podcast. This is this is a lecture. So yeah, I think the Reformation has long-term impacts not only on the way individuals see their own Christianity, but in the way they interpret sacraments, in the way they interpret religious warfare, and even state politics. No? So it has had quite a large set of very important effects. Okay, so going back to the more formal part, no, uh, this author Spielvogel says when we want to understand the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, that is, we have to return to the question that thinkers themselves were wondering, which is, what must I do to be saved? And Martin Luther, a deeply religious man from the Holy Roman Empire, found an answer that did not fit within the traditional teachings of the late medieval church. Ultimately, he split with that church, destroying the religious unity of Western Christendom. That other people were concerned with the same question is evident in the rapid spread of the Reformation. So, if you recall our lecture on the Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, which also partially takes place in the Holy Roman Empire, had some thinkers, Erasmus and, well, Erasmus, in addition to others. And as early as the Northern Renaissance, they were already calling for religious reform. Diba? How do you make sure that the individual is saved if they're too focused on religious ritual that brings the content of salvation further away from them, 'di ba? Kung hindi mo talaga iniintindi yung sacraments, yung rituals, yung text ng Bible, how are you really going to be saved, no? And that set of questions bled into the period of Martin Luther. Okay. So, if you want the long version of this, there are crash course episodes dedicated to the Protestant Reformation and the Reformation's consequences. May isa pang video on the Counter Reformation that you can find in their playlists. But for us, no, let's try to kind of understand the general importance of the Protestant Reformation. So the first thing is, which Spielvogel kind of mentions earlier, and Scott Dixon also mentions, is Christianity was fundamentally and irrevocably transformed. Without doubt, the most dramatic development of the period was the Protestant Reformation, profoundly creative and destructive at the same time. The Reformation put an end to the late medieval Catholic synthesis and replaced it with a synthesis of its own, ultimately reshaping the relationship between the believer and the divine. Dati kasi under Catholic beliefs, your priest had a very big role in interpreting the religious text for you. But under different branches of Protestantism, uh, a key feature was reading the religious text yourself and building a more personal relationship with divinity outside the arbitration of a translator. But that's just a very quick introduction to it. No? So Scott Dixon and Spielvogel agree that this is a very transformative cultural moment in the history of Europe. So, okay, para i-define muna natin. Uh, yung nangyari ay, there was a shift away from Latin Christianity, which, as we recall, was one of the main organizing forces across Western and Central Europe. Diba? Kahit na nag-aaway-away yung popes, there was no question about what their shared religion was, and that was Latin Christianity or Roman Catholic Christianity. However, the Protestant splits that Christianity, and along with those questions of personal salvation, come in questions of state religion. So, ang daming mga nagbungang questions on whether or not states are also free to decide their own religion. So, this raises questions of political and religious sovereignty within different states and led to a lot of religious warfare across Europe. So I want to highlight this as well because one of the biggest impacts of the Reformation, other than how people would see personal belief systems, is the two treaties that are kind of fundamental to modern day state systems. So yung two treaties na to ay the Treaty of Augsburg in 1555 and the Treaty of Westphalia in 1649. And they set the groundwork for the notion that states um, should be ruled as independent entities. Ibig sabihin, kung may state ka at may state ako, supposedly, you and your constituents, whether you're a democracy or a monarchy, should have the right to decide what your religion will be, kung may religion man, what your policies will be, um, and no higher force, like no pope or no emperor, should be able to dictate those things upon you. And they kind of negotiated this through these two treaties that would end certain phases of religious wars. Pero babalik tayo dyan. Ang point na nga, religiously, spiritually, importante yung Reformation, pero politically, importante din siya. This is the face of one of the reformers. His name is Zwingli, tapos Swedish naman siya. Anyway, mababalikan natin yan mamaya. Sige, so contexts muna. Sa first part ng lecture na to, magbibigay ako ng contexts, tapos konting timeline. At yung timeline na yun ay isusuperimpose natin sa timeline ng Renaissance. Okay. Kasi may parts na nag-overlap ng konti. And for this lecture, because there's a shorter scope, meaning I'm not analyzing as much stuff as in the Reformation, we will be trying to remember more specific years as dates. So, first part is going to be this timeline, and then we'll jump straight into the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so coming back to the contexts, no, there are three that I want to highlight. Firstly, if you're familiar with the Reformation, the most common context we hear about is the large amount of criticism to the Catholic Church. If you recall the lecture or the crash course episode ni John Green on the Renaissance and Latin Christianity, there were some references to the Catholic Church being a little nepotistic, or being under the thumb of various monarchs. No, so in addition to that, there were other points of criticism, like if you know about St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which is one of the most beautiful basilicas in the world. In order to build it, they started collecting these things called indulgences. Now, an indulgence is typically like it's like a pass. Because I'm not Catholic, this is how I'm going to explain it. An indulgence is a pass, a set of prayers that has been parang it's an exchange token. If I am a sinner and I constantly have to pray for my own salvation, if I buy an indulgence from the Catholic Church, which had like a physical um parang representation, then that indulgence could buy me more prayers to save me in the afterlife. So it was like a way of boosting ganyan, buying boosters for your personal prayers so that you could ensure you wouldn't go to purgatory, or at least you wouldn't go to hell. And there was a very economic reason for why so many indulgences were being sold. And that is the construction of St. Peter's Basilica and other religious works. No? So, ang iniisip ng iba ay, why are we amending doctrine? Why are we creating new aspects of Christianity? Not necessarily for doctrinal purposes or spiritual purposes, but for monetary purposes. So it was seen as a form of papal corruption. So, ayun, ang daming mga nag-collect na problems within the Catholic Church at the time. But alongside these points of criticism to the Catholic Church, you also have the rise of civic humanism, which we defined in the previous lecture under the Renaissance. So, if you recall, civic humanism, which emerges in the context of the Italian Renaissance, is this idea that to develop your best life, to develop the full human potential, besides studying art and literature and politics, the best way for you to become a fully fledged and actualized individual is to serve your state, right? Like Machiavelli. So, um, part of the critique to Catholicism was embedded in the Northern or Christian Renaissance tradition, which we saw in the previous section. And then other people started thinking about how to serve their state better and started to rethink what kind of religion will actually work within our context. No? So, on one hand, some people want to make religion closer to everyday people, and that's what's happening in the Northern Renaissance with Desiderius Erasmus encouraging deeper individual studies of biblical text and common sense criticism of the church. And on the other hand, some people are starting to rethink what religion fits their politics. Okay, so that's the second context. So, thirdly, we also start to see the first religious revolts. Actually, Luther did not represent the first one to actively revolt against the Catholic Church. Because Luther also sanctioned certain wars, but we'll talk about that more later. In fact, may mga nauna pa sa kanya. So, besides intellectual attacks on the Catholic tradition, like those of Erasmus and Thomas More from England, there were also early religious revolts staged in protest of the Latin Church. These include, for instance, the Czech Hussite Rebellion in the mid 15th century, the English Lollard uprising in the early 15th century. So while the Renaissance is happening in Italy, in other parts of Europe, you already have very early militant criticism against the Catholic Church. Okay, so what turning points do we want to remember as we're watching the story of the Reformation unfold? Okay, so my timeline here is a little different because there's more text. No? So bear with the format na lang for now. Now, the traditional timeline for the Reformation is about the mid 16th century to the mid 17th century. But if we look at the more specific details, they sometimes will fall before or after this timeline. So, titignan na lang natin yung key turning points. Okay, so just follow the story with me muna. No? In the 1520s, Martin Luther, who is a priest, he's a priest under the Roman Catholic Church in the Holy Roman Empire, begins to reorganize different churches. And the reason he's reorganizing churches is because he realizes, and we'll talk about this more later, he realizes there are fundamental doctrinal issues in the way the Catholic Church is running its operations. So he's able to kind of rationalize this, build a following amongst other princes. Kasi kung naalala nyo, the Holy Roman Empire, it's not really one state, it's many different smaller principalities. And at this time, in the 1520s, there were about 300 smaller principalities in the Holy Roman Empire. So, um, yung Holy Roman Emperor, si Charles V, he's too preoccupied with wars abroad to quell or stop internal rebellions that are being run by Lutherans. No? So, kung matatay natin to our previous lecture to, this is the period when there are some wars over Italian states. Um, but anyway, the point is the emperor is preoccupied with foreign wars, and internally he doesn't realize, or he's not able to focus on Luther reorganizing states to convert to Lutheranism away from Catholicism. And this is not just a process of princes deciding na okay, magiging Lutheran na lang kami. It often entailed wars, supporting one principality that wanted to become Lutheran, tapos pinipigilan siya ng ibang Catholic na principalities. So we'll see more of the context for that later. But for now, it's important to see how Martin Luther criticizes the Catholic Church, starts this branch of Protestantism called Lutheranism. That happens in the 1520s. Okay. But around Europe, there are other movements to establish new religions that are also Christian but also not quite Catholic. For instance, in 1534, the Act of Supremacy in England establishes the Anglican Church, which is independent of the authority of the Vatican. And there are so many documentaries and even historical dramas, so fictional work inspired by Henry VIII. Pero ang isa-summarize natin dito ay, under Henry VIII, the English state's relationship with the Catholic Church is severed through the establishment of a national church. Kasi remember, one of the key questions is, should the prince or the monarch have ultimate authority over their own kingdom in all matters? Or should they still defer to figures like the emperor or even the pope in order to decide on their state's affairs? No, and the answer by Henry VIII was, let's just create a national church and kind of amend doctrine in order to suit the state's needs. Rather than this being a reform which was primarily religious in nature, Henry's intention was actually more political, which we're familiar with, to divorce his first wife, who was Catherine of Aragon, I think. She was a Habsburg from Spain. Anyway, so he wants to divorce her because she's not bearing an heir, and he wanted to marry his mistress and possibly sire a male heir to the throne. So, madami pa siyang naging ibang wives, but one of the key motivating forces for them to create a new church was for him to create a new rule na pwede siyang mag-divorce without going to hell, di ba? It's more complicated than that, of course, pero we're just trying to remember main divergences or branches away from the Catholic Church. So far, we have Lutheranism and Anglicanism. Okay, so here's a map of the uh, Holy Roman Empire. So, nakita na natin to dati, but what we know about it now is there will be about 300 smaller principalities by the 1520s. Okay, so may Lutheranism na tayo, may Anglicanism na tayo, and in 1536, another movement emerges in Geneva, Switzerland. Now, Calvin is another reformer, and in the context of Geneva and Switzerland, Calvinism replaces Lutheranism as the dominant form of Protestantism, spreading to other parts of Europe. And I there we could explain what the differences of each of these branches are, but honestly, I think knowing the theological background and debate of each of these movements is not so important to us, because we don't have a lot of time to discuss it. So, for you guys, for this course, it's just important to know what the branches were, right? So, we have Lutheranism, Anglicanism, Calvinism. Now, imagine you were still part of the Catholic Church or the Roman Catholic Church, and you were looking at these developments. No, it's a crisis, really. And initially, the move of the Catholic Church was to try to convince these religious reformists to come back and repent. So they wanted them to let go of their new religions and essentially become Catholic again. And to do this, they organized this thing called the Council of Trent. So the Council of Trent was held over several years. So it's a parang nagmi-meeting sila ganyan from 1545 to 1563. Sometimes they invite reformists, sometimes it's just key figures in the Roman Catholic Church. And the formation of this council in Trent, which is a northern province in a northern state in Italy, it marks the formalization of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So, remember nung una, gusto nilang i-convince yung reformists na bumalik sa fold. But towards the end, naging ano siya, reaffirmation of its interpretation of Christianity. So instead of them acknowledging some of the criticisms or not doctrinal issues in Catholicism, nag-double down sila and they decided to spread their I'm trying okay, they decided to spread their Catholic propaganda. So there's Protestant propaganda, there's Catholic propaganda, even more through three main instruments. Dito actually nabuo yung Jesuits. So this Society of Jesus or the Jesuits, um, which was organized by Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and I think he was Spanish, but anyway, we'll get to that later. So the point is, they're trying to create a more militant version of uh, Catholicism, a more militant order, in order to defend the faith, right? They also develop, as a response, the Inquisition. So the Inquisition that we're familiar with is against witches and pagans, which is also part of it. But in reality, the Inquisition was also developed against other non-Catholic religions, including Protestants. So ganun kalalim yung kulo, kumbaga, yung problema nila. And then they also create the Index of Forbidden Books. And this is fascinating because remember, in order to spread ideas of not Catholic, of Christian Reformation, a key thing they're doing is publishing pamphlets and books. So the Catholic Church starts to forbid the teachings of different reformists, and this Index of Forbidden Books is formed as a part of that. No? In fact, I know this is extra information, but in the Philippines, because we were part of that, in the Philippines, umabot yung counter-reformation at dahil Catholics tayo at the time, what happened was they also gave a list of the Index of Forbidden Books to the Archbishop in Manila. And as a part of that process, they started removing books from the library in San Agustin. So may ganung process. Nasama tayo dun sa counter reformation essentially. Okay. So, what do we know so far? There are three main branches of Protestantism, and in response to these wars and these religious debates, na form yung Council of Trent, right? But instead of them compromising to the Protestants, instead they create more tools to protect the Catholic faith. Now, outside of this context, politically, from 1546 to 1555, mabubuo yung Scamaldic Wars. Okay, so I know I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it properly, but these wars are fought between Lutheran princes and Catholic Charles V. So finally, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire is now able to kind of come back and focus on um, defeating internal rebellions. At dahil nga Catholic siya, yung internal rebellions din ay Lutheranism. Now, these would end in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg. which, to end the wars, ultimately acknowledged the German rulers' right to determine their state's religions. So, after all of this fighting, finally, they got to a point where legally, na-acknowledge na yung equality of Lutheranism and Catholicism as state religions. At this point, hindi pa na-acknowledge yung Calvinism, so Calvinists were actually a little more oppressed for a longer period. And I say religious reformers here, but we have to remember they themselves were focusing on their own interpretation of Christian texts. So Luther actually also would try to stamp out other forms of Protestantism na hindi siya nag-agree with. So my time that he not only would rationalize but outright support wars against, I don't know if it's the Calvinists or other smaller groups. Pero just because they're reformers, it doesn't mean they're always friendly to each other. In fact, they're also quite violent. Anyway, this makes way to the period of the century of religious wars. Siyempre kasama yung Scamaldic Wars dito, no? Pero just to show you what the other wars are, the French Wars of Religion happened from 1562 to 1598. And to cut the long story short, it's Catholics versus French Calvinists, right? In the Anglo Spanish War, it's Catholics versus Anglicans. In the 30 Years' War, it's Calvinists versus Catholics. The result is another important treaty. If you're going to be in political science, you will hear this often. The 16, sorry, that should be 1649 Treaty of Westphalia, which establishes the modern framework for equally sovereign states. Okay, so yun yung timeline natin. As I mentioned earlier, to zero in on specific themes, we're going to look at beginnings of the Protestant Reformation in Germany. We'll talk about the spread of Protestantism very briefly. We'll try to understand the Catholic Reformation, and then we'll return to religious wars. So I'll see you in the next part.